Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to New Wave Global. I'm Asad Ejaz Butt. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who's a professor of history at the Quaid-i-Azam University. Dr. Ilhan Niaz has written a paper that's making the rounds right now, uh, especially within circles that are sort of academically involved or interested in Pakistan's bureaucracy, its civil service. The paper is very interestingly titled. It's called The Officer Class, and I read this: Pakistan's Bureaucratic Elites and the Origins of Constitutional Disorder. One of the interesting findings of this paper is sort of the origins of Pakistan's bureaucracy, how it amassed power, and perhaps its kind of tug of war with the military in the early days of the country in the 1950s, and how the two sort of so the two moving parts of the government contested for more power, and how the military ultimately took over. The development of this strong bureaucracy, which eventually kind of became the linchpin of Pakistan's governance, not just in the 50s, but perhaps in the later years, only being reformed in 1973 once. And then the second generation of reforms, I think the most important set of reforms, in my opinion, came in 2001. But much before that, I think the way the bureaucracy developed here was kind of maybe in consonance, or maybe sort of in some ways different to how the bureaucracy may have developed in India, because as Dr. Ilhan Niaz, and I quote, says, and I quote, that this has colonial roots as well. So I would like to also delve into why bureaucracies may have developed differently in the two countries if they had colonial roots, and perhaps why, if Dr. Ilhanniaz thinks that the bureaucracy has weakened in Pakistan, which is like one of the popular opinions. But let me welcome him first. Dr. Ilhan, thank you for joining.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Could you tell us a bit about this paper? I think that will be sort of a good segue into our conversation.
Okay, so I write a lot about Pakistan and South Asia. And since I focus on the evolution of the state,
Yeah.
the role of bureaucracies in the organization and functioning of states is of central importance.
Yeah.
So, in our context, what I contend is that our bureaucratic institutions, including the military and the civil service, are in fact pre-colonial institutions.
Mhm.
And our democratic institutions are in fact colonial institutions. So once South Asia moves towards independence, there is a struggle, if you will, in which the political class in India and Pakistan has to consolidate power, has to consolidate a kind of colonial democracy. But in order to consolidate that colonial democracy, they also have to contend with these very powerful and, in many cases, ancient hierarchical institutions.
Mhm.
So, the major difference, in a sense, between India and Pakistan is that in the Indian context, the Indian political class succeeds in consolidating power and establishing a stable colonial democracy. Whereas in Pakistan, what happens is that the bureaucracy and the army, for different reasons, which we can get into a bit later, they are able to seize political power for themselves. And as a result, after 1953, the political class becomes the junior partner of what Cornelius calls a governing corporation. And that governing corporation, or establishment as we might conventionally refer to it, essentially establishes a dual government when it is relatively weak, and an outright dictatorship when it feels sufficiently confident. So since 1953, with the overthrow of Khwaja Nazimuddin and Muhammad Ali Bogra being flown in a sense, Pakistan's first hybrid prime minister, if you will, you have the onset of this type of diarchy in Pakistan. And in the context of the 1950s, that diarchy ultimately resolves itself in the form of Ayub Khan's military dictatorship. So, what I'm looking at in this context is that what role exactly did the civil servants play in this entire process? because theoretically,
Hmm.
the civil service and the political class
Hmm.
have the greatest shared interest in the maintenance of civilian supremacy and constitutional order, without which, obviously, the army becomes the most powerful institution and establishes a direct or indirect dictatorship. So, in our context, what I essentially find is that the civil service is initially used by the Muslim League government in order to manage elections on its behalf, starting with the Punjab elections of 1951. And that greatly erodes the legitimacy and trust in the political class.
Hmm.
And as that trust erodes in the political class, civil servants and military officers start to develop very strong opinions about how the country ought to be governed. And they decide that, well, we are actually better suited to the task of ruling this country. And what we should do is that we should reduce the politicians to our ciphers and essentially establish a strong, centralized, authoritarian form of bureaucratic come military rule. And
Hmm.
in this transition process between, let's say, 1952 and 1958, you might argue that the civil service is the senior partner and the military is the junior partner. And then after 1958, October 27, when Ayub takes over directly, the military becomes the senior partner and the civil service becomes the junior partner, which is essentially where the balance has remained since 1958. So that's what, in a sense, I'm looking at in this particular context.
Dr. Ilhan, one question about this. If you think that Ayub's military rule sort of opened the gateways for military's incursions in the political space, as they're called in Pakistan, and perhaps the entrenchment of military or consolidation of power by the military, why couldn't that be sort of offset, or why that power imbalance could not be neutralized in later democratic periods, especially during periods like Bhutto, when Pakistan had like a very small sort of very powerful, like aristocratic populist leader in Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who was leading. Why don't you think that that power of the military was offset in those periods?
I think the problem is that if you look at the actual governance of the First People's Party government, it becomes very obvious that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had very little interest in either constitutionalism or any meaningful kind of democracy or
Hmm.
restraints on executive power. So Pakistan's tragedy is not that the military has come to believe itself to be an authoritarian savior.
Hmm.
Pakistan's tragedy is that the civilian political leaders, they also see themselves as a sort of authoritarian saviors.
Hmm.
And that creates a situation where Pakistan oscillates between arbitrary rule by military strongmen and arbitrary rule by civilian leaders. So that is the critical thing. Essentially, the onus for the consolidation of constitutionalism lies on the political class.
Hmm.
Once that consolidation is lost, then regaining it requires a very high quality of political leadership. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, in our context, that high quality of political leadership has not been forthcoming.
This seems like the classic case of the oppressed becoming the oppressors. Um,
Well, not really, because Zulfikar Ali Bhutto got his start with Iskandar Mirza and Ayub Khan.
yeah,
He was a minister in their cabinets. He was a very great sycophant of both until it suited him.
yeah.
Then, of course, he also becomes the leader of the People's Party and, helps with reference to the anti-Ayub movement. But when he comes to power, he behaves in an autocratic and an arbitrary fashion. So that is the essential problem that, if the civilian leaders don't believe in constitutionalism, it's a little bit difficult to convince the military to believe in constitutionalism.
Right. I'll take you back to the 1950s. since you talk about the colonial roots of the of how the bureaucracy, and I would get to the colonial aspect of it, but I'll backtrack to 1950s. Um, we also have the Indian civil service at the same time, and then of course both countries inherited like a similar sort of civil service structure also, as you also I think allude to in your paper. Do you think one that the bureaucracies developed differently in the first decade in India and Pakistan? If so, why do you think that happened?
I think there was one major difference between the Pakistani bureaucracy in the early days and the Indian bureaucracy in its early days. And that was that in Pakistan, the value of the evacuee property that was abandoned by Hindus and Sikhs
Hmm.
was several times greater than the value of the property that was abandoned by Muslims in India. So, as the government moved to settle the evacuee property and to resettle refugees, uh, the bureaucracy enjoyed a tremendous amount of patronage in terms of dispensing the assets that had been left behind by Hindus and Sikhs. So I think there is one very important difference between the two. Another critical difference between the two is that whereas in India, the Indian National Congress accorded top priority to the framing of a constitution and getting on with the task of holding elections and transiting to a republic, the Muslim League took a lot of time in getting around to settle important constitutional questions. So the Muslim League does not appear to have been in any hurry, if you will, when it comes to framing a new constitution. In 1949, for example, March 1949, nearly 3 years after the Constituent Assembly had been elected, we pass an objectives resolution. As late as 1952, we are still debating basic principles of that constitution. So, what that does is that it creates the impression, not perhaps incorrect, that the Muslim League government is shy of an electoral contest at a national level. And indeed, when the provincial elections are held in Punjab, for instance, and I cite this in my paper, it in fact does turn out that there are a considerable number of constituencies where the police and civil service have to be used in order to secure an outcome that is favorable for the Muslim League government.
Hmm.
So I think that is another very important difference, that the weakness, in a sense, of the Muslim League, the fact that it is not able to get on with the task of developing a credible electoral commission and having the first elections and moving forward, basically, getting us out the gate, if you will, that plays a very important role. Of course, once the Constituent Assembly does eventually get its act together and move towards the framing of a final constitution bill, that's when the civil service strikes and dissolves the Constituent Assembly.
Hmm.
So that also basically shows you how the assembly had lost a lot of its popular legitimacy during this time. And there's a very good study about this by Inamur Rahman on political opinion in Pakistan during the 50s, in which he basically shows that after the dissolution of the first Constituent Assembly, there was generally a favorable response from the public, because the feeling was that the politicians, they are intriguing with the anti-Ahmadi movement, they are delaying the task of framing a constitution, they're not really serious about government. So it's a very interesting situation where the democratically aspirant political class is not able to set up a framework that could then consolidate its process.
I'll come to the Muslim League part later, but backtracking further to the pre-partition era, one opinion is that, a Weberian kind of a bureaucracy was established in India by the British. And I don't know if you've seen this, but several texts have sort of peddled this idea that It was the Weberian bureaucracy was set up as a cover for the British plunder of, key commodities like spices from South Asia. What do you see as the basis of the kind of bureaucracy that the colonials set up? Was this political economy reason like, the primary reason you think?
Well, I think that when you look at the proportion of plunder that
Hmm.
the British engaged in, that was actually highest during the early phase of the conquest and consolidation of British rule. And it then declined
Sorry, Dr. Ilhan, to cut you. By the early phase, you mean the early
between
days of the East India
1757,
Company?
no, no, between 1757
Yeah,
to, let's say, 1840 or thereabouts, the early period of the conquest and consolidation of British rule
got
in
it,
South Asia.
got it.
Uh, that was a period in which, relative to what it later became, the Indian civil service structure of the British was relatively underdeveloped.
Hmm.
And then post 1858, especially, it assumes the more formalistic character that people allude to as a kind of a Weberian setup or a mock Weberian setup, if you will.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, there are, though paradoxically, of course, Weber comes later and this bureaucracy comes earlier, but the key principles of that post 1858 bureaucracy were that, for instance, the recruitment should be through various forms of competitive exams, albeit held in England. Uh, it was a civil service that enjoyed lifetime social security benefits. It was a civil service that was generally immune to overt political interference by the executive.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it also enjoyed, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of practice, a stability in terms of its posting and transfers, which generally proceeded at an average rate of, let's say, once every 2.5 to 3 years.
Hmm.
So, in that sense, it was a predictable and a merit-based bureaucracy. And over a period of time, the provincial tiers and then ultimately the central tiers of that bureaucracy were Indianized. So Indians increasingly joined that bureaucracy at different levels. So in that respect, when we look at the evolution of the British Indian bureaucracy as we move closer towards independence, a higher and higher percentage of the civil service at the provincial and the central levels are in fact locally recruited. They're not from England. And that, of course, creates an expectation that if you take partition and World War II out of the equation, then let's say by the mid 1950s, early 1960s, the process of Indianization would more or less have been complete.
Hmm.
So you would have had Indian generals, Indian inspector generals of police, Indian administrative secretaries outnumbering the British quite considerably. So at that point, you might hypothesize that India might have become some sort of self-governing dominion on the pattern of Australia or Canada,
Hmm.
albeit with important differences as well. But of course, that didn't happen. World War II happened. That essentially made it impossible for the British Raj to continue. And in the scramble to get out of South Asia, you had a very mismanaged partition process that disproportionately hurt Pakistan. It also hurt India, but relative to population and resources, it was a far more painful birth for Pakistan. And that painful birth had consequences for us, perhaps more than India.
How do you see the bureaucracy today? I'm getting to the more important parts of the interview, things that I'm interested in. One of the opinions, Dr. Ilhan, and I'm certain that you must have heard this, is that the bureaucracy has weakened over the years and doesn't perform the role that perhaps it did before 1973 when the common system was adopted. And And later, after 2001, when the local bureaucracy, uh, it is uh, it is often suggested was weakened by the Local Government Reforms Act of 2001. Do you think that the bureaucracy has weakened over the years and the military has now sort of a- arrogated more power over the last perhaps 2 decades or more?
But the interesting thing is that right now there are approximately 1.3 million federal civilian government employees. And out of those 1.3 million federal civilian government employees, about 5% are in the officer grades, 17 to 22. But whenever the government needs to do anything serious, it either has to get outside consultants or it has to call in the armed forces. So I would argue that yes, in terms of effectiveness, the civil service has gotten a lot weaker over time. And this weakening is, of course, also relative to the expectations of society and the objective conditions in which that civil service has to operate.
Hmm.
On the other hand, in terms of the wealth that you can amass in the civil service, in
Hmm.
terms of the political profile civil servants can enjoy,
Hmm.
in terms of the different perks and privileges and capital gains they can accumulate through subsidized plots and other such things, I would say that the civil service is a lot stronger today, perhaps, than it was during the early years, when essentially you just got a salary and that was about it. So I would essentially say that yes, our civil service is less effective, but it is also in many ways more politically powerful and more socially and economically intrusive than it was during, let's say, the first 20 years or 25 years of Pakistan's existence. One might also argue that it is a lot less professionally oriented. It is more oriented towards fulfilling the arbitrary commands of whoever happens to be the ruler of the day. So there is no sense, let us say, amongst civil servants that they are servants of the law as opposed to servants of whoever happens to be the boss. So there is also that what we might call moral decay, if you will. Another important thing that has happened is, which did not happen in the 50s and 60s and until recent times, is social media. So
Hmm.
thanks to social media, people now have a sort of window into the high life of many civil servants. They get a chance to peek into, if you will, the sycophancy, the darbar culture that prevails
Hmm.
whenever civil servants are in front of politically powerful people. And that perhaps also produces a weakening of its image and its prestige in the eyes of the public. So I think on balance, the civil service has a greater capacity to feather its own nest, and it has an inferior capacity to actually deliver in a manner that is competitive when it comes to public services and development and the things that actually the people of this country need.
One of the tenets of good governance is government effectiveness, Dr. Ilhan, and I can see that, in your paper also you sort of you I think one of your opinions is that, one countries like Pakistan should not, and I correct me if I got this wrong, that should not have like a very asymmetrically powerful bureaucracy or civil service. So you think that, in terms of effectiveness, you think that the bureaucracy has weakened or the civil service has weakened. How does this impact on government effectiveness as a whole? Do you think will it have a positive impact on government effectiveness as a whole?
So obviously, if the bureaucracy cannot administer the day-to-day things it is responsible for administering,
Hmm.
then the government can come up with the finest policies in the world. who is going to actually implement them. So having an effective government or a relatively effective government
Hmm.
is something which every type of government requires.
Hmm.
So in our context, if you have a dictatorship or you have a democracy,
Yeah.
in both cases, there are various policies, projects that the government will try to implement. And the civil service is the primary agency through which, in most cases, those projects should be implemented. But in our context, what we perhaps see is that whenever there is a important thing to be done, you also now have perhaps the greater encroachment of the military in terms of the execution of projects. And though it's still in its early days, but the SIFC is perhaps a kind of indicator of exasperation with the normal channels of doing business and making projects and other such things. So I think that is something which is in the interest of every government. But
Hmm.
the problem, of course, is that if you or I think that an effective government is one that implements laws and policies effectively, the problem is that Pakistan's rulers see the state apparatus and its effectiveness in personalized terms. So they are more interested in what the state machinery can do relative to their own political interests, relative to their own economic interests, relative to their own dynastic interests.
Yeah.
And they are less interested in these broader questions of policy or program or other such things. In fact, in many cases, they are more than happy to outsource the cerebral function of the bureaucracy to international donors and consultants and leave those things on autopilot. So there is also something else which denudes us of capacity, that if you can't actually think for yourself, you're not likely to achieve much by way of development or improving the quality of life for your people.
By by weakening effectiveness of the bureaucracy or civil service being sort of good for government effectiveness overall, I I kind of meant what you went towards in the end was that maybe the replacement would be good. But in Pakistan's case, as you already mentioned, the replacement has been SIFC, not like a good alternative to a colonial bureaucracy. That's what I meant, essentially.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.
Um, yeah. So my last question to you, Dr. Ilhan, we're approaching the end of the slotted time for this interview, is is the case with India's bureaucracy, because one of the objectives of this interview was to sort of do this comparative analysis between two countries. Do you think that the same did not happen in India? Because I do see the bureaucracy as a rentier class in India as well. I see the bureaucracy being having consolidated a lot of power. I see the bureaucracy using, their power sometimes for personal gains also. So do you think that, and I also see consultants wielding a lot of power, international organizations, donors doing active work in India. Do you see that, I wanted to pick your brains on this. Do you think the bureaucracy is acted in manifestly different ways in India?
I think the first thing is that the major difference between India and Pakistan is that the Indian National Congress opted to create a planned economy, whereas Pakistan did not opt to create a planned economy. So when you create a planned economy, that naturally increases the policy and regulatory power of the state machinery.
Mhm.
So when you look at the policy and regulatory powers of the various projects and programs launched by the Indian National Congress, including land reforms, for instance, you very clearly see that the Indian civil service or the Indian Administrative Service and other parts of the Indian civil service machinery is, in terms of functionality, more powerful than Pakistan because it is less scared of landed or business or other interests.
Hmm.
Because it doesn't need those interests to consolidate its own half-baked political rule.
Hmm.
So if there is a government policy that we're going to provide food subsidies, or we're going to redistribute land, or we're going to invest in the creation of hydroelectric power, or whatever other things which Nehru had in mind, including building the IITs and all of that, the civil service can then execute those with the support of the political class. And the political class essentially absorbs the political feedback, the negative public reaction, as the case might be. It is their job to sort all of that out.
Hmm.
In the Pakistani context, the civil service finds itself in a situation where after 1953, it has to both manage the politics of the country, which it is terrible at, and it also has to manage the administration and the development aspect of governance, which
Hmm.
arguably it is better at in the 50s and 60s than it is now. So that is something which spreads our civil service into areas where essentially it is not designed for. So when you move civil servants or military officers, as the case might be, into political management, into rigging elections, into cobbling together coalitions, they're essentially operating outside of their comfort zone. They should not be doing those things. And the more they do those things, the more the political system and the constitutional system ends up getting fractured and controversialized in the eyes of the people and in the eyes of many other important political factions in the country. So, in our context, we have a civil service that is politically more powerful than its Indian counterpart. But that is in terms of what it is prepared to do, in terms of modernize the country according to its vision, a lot more timid because it needs political support. So Ayub Khan needs the basic Democrats to vote him in under his fraudulent constitution as the president.
Yeah.
He needs the help of the officially patronized Muslim League to provide him with a veneer of parliamentary cover. In India, it's out and out. There is no diarchy. The government in form is the government in being. And the government in being is legitimately constituted through a political process in which the loser accepts the results as being legitimate. In our context, the loser never accepts the result as being legitimate. It's always that the election was rigged, and in many cases, there is not an unfair assertion on their part.
Hmm.
So it's a very different dynamic, if you will, that evolves in both India and in Pakistan. And the major variable, of course, in this is the quality and the authenticity of the early political class, their own commitment to the consolidation of a constitutional parliamentary system, their understanding of what to do then once that system is in place.
Hmm.
And in that, the Indian bureaucracy has a lot more control over the country's fate than the Pakistani bureaucracy does when it comes to the actual processes of government and economic policy and social policy and other such things.
Hmm.
But it does not have the kind of political clout as the Pakistani counterpart develops. So you have a very interesting, when you look at that. And of course, when you come to more recent times, what we see is that over the last 10 years or so, the Modi government has gradually, without any fanfare, without any fancy announcements, reduced the dominance of the administrative service
Hmm.
over the overall architecture of India's state machinery.
Hmm.
So, over the last 10 years, there's been a gradual specialization of the state machinery. In
Hmm.
our context, Cornelius in 1962 made the argument for a highly specialized ministry-based civil service, but the then CSP convinced Ayub that no, this does not suit you and this does not suit us. So let's forget about what the old man is saying. So I think that's also an important difference that in our context, because of its political clout and its political salience, the civil service is in a position to stymie many of the reforms, eventually roll them back. You mentioned the local government reforms of Musharraf. In many cases, I think after 2008, the old powers were restored to the civil service, and that system was dismantled. Our political leaders are generally hostile to any kind of meaningful elected local government. So, this is again something which, in the Indian context, you don't see. So, in India, you have the local elections, one party can win there. You can have the regional elections, another party can win there. You can have the federal elections, another party can win there. So, I think there is something to be said for Nehru's ability to set in motion a process that has continued on a kind of inertia to the present day. And in our context, we also set in motion a process of military and bureaucratic intervention in the political process. And that inertia or that inertial momentum has carried through to our present day. So it's a very interesting natural experiment between India and Pakistan that, two countries with broadly similar indicators, colonial legacies, other such things, you essentially alter one important variable, the consolidation of constitutional rule and the political class, and what kind of outcomes do you then start to get? And I would argue that the outcomes that Pakistan has gotten from the secession of East Pakistan to its deep economic stagnation over the last 40 years are far worse than what India has experienced, although India has also experienced a lot of problems, and it's no bed of roses over there either.
Do you think one mediating variable in this natural experiment uh, is is the role of the landed elite in Pakistan, which wasn't there in the India's case, and that sort of led to disparate outcomes when it comes to the consolidation of power of the bureaucracy? Because in Pakistan's case, we see that the landed elite, you talk about the military and the bureaucracy, but the landed elite has also played like a big role in how in sort of the bureaucracy and the landed elite, especially at the local level, have been hand in glove with each other for the longest part and have secured each other's interests.
I think in India, the Congress and the bureaucracy basically broke the back of the landlord class.
Yeah,
And in Pakistan, they needed to ride the back of the landlord class in order to maintain a figment of constitutional rule.
mm,
And our landlord class was more than happy to be co-opted and taken along for the ride.
exactly.
So this is again something which had to be settled at a political level. And in our context, the politics of the early period ended up creating a lot more nuisance value for this class.
Mm.
Whereas in India, this class was at the receiving end of pretty meaningful land redistribution and a stripping away of a lot of its traditional clout.
Dr. Ilhan, this is all extremely wise, insightful, and knowledgeable. I wanted to carry this conversation, but unfortunately, we've reached the end of this interview's time. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, my pleasure.